What is up, people? Hope you're well. I've been a bit lazy with the YouTube videos lately, and I've just been posting training clips, and look, realistically, I'm not the most exciting person to watch training of. I am an extremely average powerlifter. So what I'm going to do over the course of the next few weeks as we're leading into the competition for Powerlifting America is I'm going to try to make these videos a little bit more informative. And since we are now in the peak, and I've never actually really discussed what a peak is or what is the point of trying to have some kind of peak and taper leading into a competition, why not start now? Throughout the video, I'm going to post up my training clips just from this week, my top lifts. The short of it is training's gone pretty well. It's week number 1, not really expecting too much from this week, so I'll have the lifts playing up on the screen, but we're going to talk about peaking. Okay, so what is peaking? So when we're training, we are building fitness, we're building adaptations, but we are also building fatigue. And through the training process, as the weeks go on, we are always going to be building this fitness. We're going to be having these adaptations occur. However, every time we train, we're also lamping on a little bit of fatigue, okay? And this is kind of known as like the fitness fatigue model. Now, when we have a training session, as you've probably experienced, if you do a training session today, like I just did my squats today, I probably would not be able to replicate the exact same session on the same day. We are seeing that there is an impacted performance that we will get from fatigue. Now, by the time you train next, you'll have some level of fatigue cleared. However, this fatigue does not completely go by the end of the training week, right? So over the course of a training block, you are building this fitness, you're building these adaptations, and you are having this fatigue continually build, but you never really get an opportunity to completely clear it. What a peaking block does, essentially, you are going to be going through this same process of building fitness and building fatigue, but towards the end, you're going to have a taper, and that taper essentially is to try to maximize your performance. So during the taper week, you're going to have a decrease in volume generally, and you're going to try to maintain intensity. Now, decreasing the volume, that is going to wash away some of the fatigue, and should all of this process work out, on competition day, you'll be able to have your performance peak. This is essentially what we are trying to do when we are going through a peak and a taper for powerlifting. Now, it's important to understand that you're not just peaking during this specific block, you're peaking year round, right? But you are not peaking specifically for competition. So when you are just going through a block of 5s, for example, you will reach a peak condition towards the end of that block, right? And you probably notice this yourself. You are able to add weight for a certain number of weeks until you start to see regress. So you're having some kind of dip in performance that until you take a deload, this performance does not start to come back. Outside of competition, in this context, you would have a deload as opposed to a taper. Now, during a deload, you can maintain intensity, or you can drop intensity, or you can drop volume, or you can keep volume where it is. It really doesn't matter for the purposes of like the deload as such. There is some new research coming out on that at the moment that I haven't read. That could be good for a future video. But when it does come to peaking, for example, for a competition, you want to keep that intensity high, because on the platform, you are going to be lifting a huge amount of weight. Now, what we know about what we are trying to accomplish on that competition day, right? You're thinking about trying to maximize your performance in 3 specific lifts, okay? Now, what do you need for those lifts to occur and to get the best outcomes from it, right? Muscle mass is obviously a big factor, okay? Well, realistically, you know, if we are taking a deload or taking a week of reduced training, we're not losing muscle mass, right? It's going to be very difficult for those gains to completely fade away. But what about neural drive? What about things like skill? The likes of skill, that can degrade pretty quickly. So still during the likes of a powerlifting peak, while we are having this drop in volume over the course of the peak and taper itself, we still want to ensure that we're keeping in a lot of our competition specific lifts, and it doesn't even have to be at a very, very high intensity. The week before a competition, for example, you might just hit openers, you might just hit last warm-ups. You don't necessarily need to be increasing load in the bar every single week into competition. So the plan to really develop your peak, or kind of figure out what is going to work for you in terms of a peak, really kind of begins in your like development blocks. So your blocks of training that are outside of competition, right? Because you're going to be able to see by just keeping an eye on your performance how you can increase load or increase reps or whatever week on week until you hit that point where you start to regress. And you could probably have a good idea to say that, okay, this is probably the amount of exposures to this lift that I kind of need to potentially hit a peak condition, and that may translate over into a peaking block where you start to get a lot more specific with things, okay? And then from there you can essentially look to backtrack or reverse engineer from competition day until when your peak and block should begin, because we need to kind of start from competition day and kind of build backwards versus start at the very start and then hopefully on competition day we kind of hit what we want. We don't necessarily need to think of numbers, but we just have to think about how we respond to volume intensity, how we respond to fatigue, and how that affects our performance, and then kind of try to backtrack that from the competition day all the way back to week 1 of your peak, for example. So the way my training is going to look at the moment is the week of the competition. So my taper, I'll have a heavy bench single during that week, but my other session during that week will simply just be a low effort squat and deadlift session. I'm talking about RPE 4, just to ensure that I'm keeping that skill high and I'm getting some practice in with the lift itself. 1 week out, I'm going to have last warm-ups or I'm going to have openers. Realistically, it's going to be last warm-ups, but that's going to be dependent on how I feel coming into that session. Prior to that, that is when I'll be hitting the likes of my heaviest lift. So I'll be hitting my top squat, I'll be hitting my top deadlift. For the weeks preceding that, it's going to be likes of kind of second attempts, openers, last warm-ups. So that's kind of the way that my peak will essentially ramp up in intensity and volume will be dropping all the while. We're essentially forcing load on the bar every single week compared to what you may do in a development block, okay? Because if you have singles in a development block, you are likely going to be keeping them in there to practice the skill, but you're not necessarily looking at specifically bumping up that load every single week. If load goes up to maintain the RPE, that's fantastic, but it's not necessarily what you're there to do. During development blocks, you're trying to build more muscle mass, you're trying to build work capacity, because these are the things that you're trying to leverage during the peak. During the peak, you're not looking to build more muscle mass, you're looking to potentially increase the neurological connections between your brain to the muscle mass to allow you to output more force, okay? That part is done. So during a developmental block, you may just have that single in there to practice the skill, familiarize yourself with heavy weights to overcome the fear of potentially doing singles if that is something that gets in your head close to competition time, but you're not there to just add loads to the bar every week. During a peak, you will be adding loads to the bar every single week. The aim during the peak with your singles is to build the weight on the bar up until you get close to something that's going to be around 100%, because when it comes to your time on the platform, if you've not handled the intensities that you will be lifting on the platform, well, one, for your confidence is not going to be great, but it is unlikely that you've not primed your body to be in a position to handle those loads and lift them when the time is right. In previous blocks with my training, I would be doing a frequency of like squatting and deadlifting that's around 2 to 3 times per week, with bench around 3 to 4 times per week, and this includes things like assistance work as well, so things like RDLs, which are not necessarily deadlifts from the floor, but they are something that can contribute to the lift itself. Now during those development blocks, those lifts can have some degree of variation to them, because I could be looking to build strength in weak portions of a range of motion, I could just be looking to increase overall muscle mass as I've already discussed. So I can have a high degree of variety to these actual squat variations, these deadlift variations, so they don't necessarily need to be the competition lifts themselves. Now coming into the peak, this specificity of training is going to increase to include more of the competition style lifts, because when we do get closer and closer to competition, we want to ensure that we are performing our comp lifts the way we should be performing them on the platform. Nice, snappy, explosive movements, and trying to maximize our force production through every portion of the range of motion. If we are incorporating the likes of tempos, pauses, like too frequently during this phase, that could trickle into our competition squat performance during our weekly training session and then potentially impact the competition day itself. So it would be a better idea to, during this peaking phase, potentially have some maybe lighter sessions which you are performing on those competition lifts to familiarize yourself with getting it to your competition stance, your competition setup, and performing your competition movements like you would on competition day, and then having a heavier session during the week where you are essentially going to be ensuring that you're adding weight to the bar every single week to get closer to your peak condition. Now when we are looking at this like phase of training, we're also trying to think of like, well, what type of taper is going to work the best for us, because there's different ways that you can taper your training to have a better effect, right? And this is going to vary person to person, so there are different type of tapers that we can look at using during this phase, and that's really going to be dependent on you as an individual and what you feel you respond, not what you feel you respond best to, what you have found that you respond best to, okay? What you feel during a peak block, yeah, it can be yeah, can be different to what you really need to be doing. So it's really important that you do have a coach bring you through this process if you've never went through it before, because yeah, your head can get in the way. So types of tapers that we can look at here, we have linear, and then we have step, and then we have also exponential. Linear essentially is just through this peak and block, you're having a gradual decrease, pretty much like almost week to week of volume. So you may have like reps going down. So say for example, on my program at the moment, I will have, you know, a 3x3, and then a 3x2, and then a 3x1. So I'll have something like that on my program for like squats, for example. Okay, so this is an example here of like a linear fashion. Okay, now you could also have a step. So step essentially is when you have a large degree of a drop of volume very quickly. So you could have this like 1 week out from a competition, for example, where you have like 30 to 70% volume reduction in that final week. Then during that week, you might just be going in, as I said, hitting your last warm-ups, and then you have competition day. Okay, so you might do fuck all during that week, and this is known as a step taper. So you're keeping your volume pretty much set throughout the block up until competition. And then you could have exponential. So exponential could just be every single week as you get closer to competition, you have pretty sizable drops in volume, and they tend to get bigger and bigger as you get closer to the meet. Now there is a good deal of variation in what people respond best to. So if you are a very large, very strong lifter, you will probably do better with like a larger taper. Okay, so that would include having your bigger lifts further from competition, because you may need a longer taper to dissipate all the fatigue that you've built up over the course of your training block through your peak to allow you to perform your best in competition day. But then if you're a smaller lifter, you're not necessarily as strong as you like to be, well then you could probably get away with having a shorter taper. So you could get away with hitting your competition lifts like even a week out, for example. In terms of what you can expect from peaking, however, and like the results you'll get from it, like you're talking about a pretty marginal increase in terms of like your competition lifts. Like you could be looking at like a 1 to 3% increase on your lifts. So it's nothing night and day. And there are some people who don't even really follow any kind of specific peaking process as such. They might just train into the meet, right? And this is going to be pretty valuable if you are competing like multiple times throughout a year, or you have another meet in close proximity. You could essentially maybe just in like the final few weeks before just have a ramp up of your intensity in singles, and then just the week of the competition just adjust your training to be a lot lower volume to perform on a day that you want to. However, off the back of this, you can just go straight back into normal training, versus somebody who is going to be a little bit more kind of invested in one particular meet. They may have a larger taper, they have a larger reduction in training volume overall during their peak, so that they can maximize the performance on that given day. So yeah, that about wraps up this video. So peaking, like, you know, it's definitely worthwhile doing, and it's definitely worthwhile being brought through this process. So if you have a coach, or if you don't have a coach, do get one to bring you through the process, because, you know, I've done a good few of these now at this point, and I can tell you, like, having somebody external there to kind of give feedback to, and, you know, to look at your lifts and kind of let you know that like what you're feeling is okay. Because pretty much every single meet I've done 1 week out after I've done like my heaviest lifts, those weeks have actually felt the worst. So the weeks where I'm actually like hitting like last warm-ups or like openers, like, you know, that's generally when you kind of feel the weakest, or when I felt the weakest at least. And having that happen like, you know, a week out from competition, that can be a little bit of a mindfuck, right? But then competition day, once you have dropped your fatigue, then you start to feel how the weights feel when you're warming up, you know, the confidence comes back. So it does work. How much it does work, that really depends. But from my own experience, like, probably like the most important thing that I have learned through doing like numerous amount of peaks is just pacing yourself properly through the peak. And remember that it's like what you hit in the platform, and not necessarily what you're hitting in training, that matters. You know, it doesn't matter if you hit like a phenomenal weight, like, you know, week 2 of your peak, right? Like you're hitting PBs on your first few weeks of the peak, because that could actually just mean that you have less room to move then as you get closer and closer to the meet itself. And you may have to start pulling back on intensity and volume way more than you need to, or way more than you should be doing, and then that leading to a suboptimal performance on the day. That is all I have for you today. So thank you very much for watching. We'll be back next week. Yeah, if you have any suggestions for content, do let me know in the comments. But yeah, other than that, I'll talk to you soon.